Hey everybody, welcome to another study out of the Gospel of Mark. Today, we're in chapter 16. In chapter 15, Jesus has been crucified and he's been buried. And now we get to the crescendo of the gospel, which is, of course, the resurrection. So let's begin reading at verse 1 of chapter 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Mark tells us that Sabbath is now over, which means it has to be after 6 p.m. on Saturday evening. Mark also tells us that there are 3 women that make this journey to anoint the body of Jesus. These 3 women were there at the crucifixion, according to Mark chapter 15 and verse 40. And then also 2 of those women were present at the burial, according to Mark chapter 15 and verse 47. The 2 Marys were there at the burial. So these ladies are going with perfumed oils to anoint the body of Jesus. Now, this obviously is an addition to what has already been used to prepare Jesus' body for burial. And by the way, they were anointing for the purpose of not preserving the body. Embalming was not practiced by the Jews. And obviously, Simon and Nicodemus and others had prepared the body of Jesus before burial with spices. So what the women are doing in all likelihood is just demonstrating their love for Jesus, and they're concerned about perhaps the odor of a body that is decomposing. And so they want to lovingly cover it in perfumed oil. I read a statement that struck me and explained, I think, in part what these women were doing. The statement goes like this: love often prompts people to do what, from a practical point of view, is considered useless. Was there any incredible value in what these women were doing by anointing the body? Not really, but they were demonstrating something motivated by love. And I know we often do the same thing, and it's a good thing to do. Look at verse 2. Very early on in the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. Mark wants us to know the timing, and he says it was very early on Sunday morning. Now, why didn't they go on Saturday night? It was probably too dark, and so they got up very, very early on Sunday morning to make the trip to the tomb. Look at verse 3. And they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? Now, remember, 2 of the women, the 2 Marys, were there at the burial, so they knew exactly where the tomb was. But as they're walking, the 3 women are discussing among themselves how they're going to get into the tomb. Who's going to roll that big stone away? And what's interesting, when you read other gospel writers, it seems like these women are completely unaware and consequently unconcerned about the fact that there is a Roman guard posted at the tomb, and there's also a seal on that stone in front of the tomb. Their concern, again, is who's going to move the stone? And that's a legitimate concern because it is a big stone that probably on their own they would be unable to move. Look at verses 4 and 5. But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Mark makes no attempt to explain how the stone was moved, who moved it. He just doesn't get into that at all. But what he does tell us is once those 3 women were inside the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe. And obviously you and I are thinking it's an angel. But Mark doesn't explicitly describe him as an angel, although Matthew does in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 2. So the reaction of these women when they see this angel, this young man, is they're dumbfounded. They're scared. They're perplexed. They don't know what to make of what they're seeing. Look at verse 6. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. So, this is a fascinating interchange. The three women, they're in the tomb. They're scared because they see this young man in a white robe. It's an angelic being. And obviously this young man can tell that they're frightened. And so he says to them, don't be alarmed. And these are Galilean women. So I got to believe that when this young man describes Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth, it was somewhat comforting to them. They saw the connection there. And the angel just speaks in this wonderful, succinct way and says, you're looking for Jesus. He's not here. He is risen. And then he invites them to take a look around the empty tomb. There is no body. What a wonderful, wonderful conversation. So they're looking at an empty tomb, and that invites the question, well, what happened to the body of Jesus? And God knew that these women would need a word of explanation. And again, this young angel, this young man, gives that word. God graciously provides it, and it's simply, he's risen. The resurrection has occurred. And that's what this gospel is ultimately all about, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And you know, through the years, a number of explanations have been given for why the body wasn't there. For instance, conjectured that the body was stolen or that the women came to the wrong tomb. I think that's one of the reasons why Mark takes great pains to let us know that the two Marys were there at the burial. They knew the right tomb to go to. Another explanation that's been given is that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but they put his body in the tomb and it was resuscitated and he walked out of the tomb alive. He never actually died. Well, I don't know about you, but those don't ring very true to me. Again, I'm drawn back to what Jesus said would happen, and that is, he rose from the dead. He was in fact dead, but God brought him back to life. Look at verse 7. So this young angel says, but go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. I love this line. The angel tells the women, go tell the disciples. But did you notice specifically Peter is mentioned here? Now I want to remind you what we've told you often in this study. Mark's primary resource or source of information for his gospel is Peter. And so I find it really interesting that included is what the angel, this young man, said to the women, go tell the disciples and Peter. Why is Peter singled out? I think because Jesus had predicted, and it had come to pass, that Peter would deny him 3 times. Remember how boastful Peter had been. If everybody else forsakes you, I will not. I will stay with you, even if I have to die with you. But he didn't. He failed miserably. And so I think God knew that Peter needed a word, needed his name to be called out specifically to indicate you're still a part of this group. You are still valuable. I still want to meet with you. So go tell the disciples and Peter. All right, now look at verse 8. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The confrontation, the meeting with this angel, this young man, had proven to be almost too much for these three women. And who can blame them? I know I would have felt the same way. Mark says they left trembling and bewildered. They were afraid. And so they didn't say anything. They were kind of silenced by their fear for a while. Now we know later on they're going to have much to say, much to report to the disciples about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But at this point, fear has overwhelmed them, and they're amazed. Imagine it. The tomb is empty. And so we'll pick it up tomorrow and finish out chapter 16.